Have you ever felt your soul tearing itself into pieces from the inside? Not from some outside force, but from the soul itself destroying itself bit by bit? Saint Teresa of Avila saw this happen. She watched it unfold in ways that still shake the foundations of what we think we know about spiritual death. In 1577, Teresa of Avila wrote something that would haunt the church for centuries. She had just turned 62 years old. Her hands ached from the quill. Her body carried the weight of founding 17 monasteries across Spain. But none of that physical pain came close to what she had witnessed in the realm of the spirit. Teresa saw souls dying while their bodies kept breathing. She saw hope extinguishing itself like a candle flame that turns inward and consumes its own wax. And she wrote it all down in a manuscript called The Interior Castle, finishing it in just 67 days despite being gravely ill. The vision came to her on the Feast of the Holy Trinity in 1577. She was praying in the choir of St. Joseph's Monastery in Avila when God showed her a crystal castle with 7 chambers. At the center sat a throne of divine light, but what terrified her was not the light. It was the souls she saw trapped in the outer chambers, unable to move inward, paralyzed not by chains, but by something worse, by the slow death of their own desire to reach God. If you value documented history about the mystics and saints like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the collected works of Saint Teresa of Avila, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez, and published by ICS Publications, the definitive scholarly edition of her complete writings, approved by the Discalced Carmelite Order. These are not popularized retellings. These are direct translations from Teresa's original Spanish manuscripts held in the Carmelite archives. Now back to the information. Teresa described these souls with precision that cuts like surgical steel. She wrote that they were like people with paralyzed limbs, hands and feet present but useless, the soul intact but unable to function. She said they lived in the courtyard of the castle, surrounded by reptiles and vermin, having become so accustomed to crawling things that they started to imitate their movements. This was not metaphor. Teresa meant it literally in the spiritual sense. She saw souls that had stopped rising, stopped reaching, stopped hoping, and in that cessation, something inside them began to die while their hearts still beat. The mechanics of this death fascinated and terrified her in equal measure. In chapter 32 of her autobiography, she recorded her vision of a place where souls experienced this interior death fully realized. She was 50 years old when she saw it. The year was 1565. She was in prayer at the convent of the Incarnation when suddenly, without warning, she found herself transported. The entrance looked like a long, narrow alley, like the mouth of an oven. Low ceiling, dark, confined. The ground was saturated with muddy water that gave off a stench she could not describe. Putrid vermin swarmed everywhere. At the end of this alley, a hole carved into the wall like a cupboard, and in that cramped space, she found herself pressed in, unable to sit or lie down. But Teresa insisted that the physical horrors were pleasant compared to what she felt in her soul. She used the word despair 17 times in her description, not the despair of someone facing external suffering, the despair of a soul tearing itself apart from within. She wrote that if she said the soul was being torn from the body, that would be insufficient, because in this place, the soul itself was doing the tearing. The soul itself was the executioner. The interior fire she described was not punishment applied from outside. It was the soul's own nature turning against itself, burning, crumbling. And the worst part, she said, was being utterly without the power to hope for comfort. Not that comfort was withheld, that the capacity to hope for it had died. Those walls, terrible to look at, closed in on themselves. No light, blackest darkness. Yet somehow everything that could give pain by being seen remained visible. She could not breathe, could not move, could not escape. And she knew, in that vision, that this was endless. No intermission, no end. When Teresa came back to herself, she was trembling so violently that the sisters around her thought she was having a seizure. Her body temperature dropped. Her hands went ice cold. The sisters wrapped her in blankets, but she kept shaking for hours. And when she finally could speak, she told them that even 6 years later, as she wrote the account, the natural warmth of her body still chilled when she thought about what she had seen. 17 other nuns at the convent of the Incarnation witnessed her physical state after this vision. Their testimonies were recorded in the process for her beatification. Sister Maria Bautista said Teresa's face had gone pale as death. Sister Ana de San Bartolome said her pulse was barely detectable. Sister Isabel de Santo Domingo said Teresa wept for 3 days straight after the experience. But what Teresa saw was not just a vision of a distant place. It was a vision of what happens to souls right here, right now, when hope dies quietly inside them. She saw it happening to people she knew, people who walked and talked and ate and slept, but whose souls had entered a state she called spiritual paralysis. In the interior castle, she described how this death progresses. It starts in the first mansion, the outermost chamber. Souls here are not yet dead but already sick. They're capable of entering the castle, capable of moving toward God, but they don't. The reptiles and venomous creatures that represent worldly attachments have bitten them so many times that they're now paralyzed, not by the venom of a single deadly bite, but by the accumulated poison of 1,000 small compromises. Teresa wrote that these souls still have their reasoning faculties intact. They can understand truth when it's presented to them. They can even recognize God's voice calling them deeper into the castle, but they don't move, not because they can't, because something inside them has quietly given up. She distinguished this from ordinary spiritual dryness. Spiritual dryness, she said, is when God withdraws consolation as a test. The soul feels nothing, but keeps praying anyway, keeps moving forward anyway. This builds spiritual muscle. This is normal. This is growth. But what Teresa saw in these outer chambers was different. These souls had stopped praying, not because they felt nothing, because they had lost the conviction that prayer mattered. They had looked at their lives, at their sins, at their failures, and concluded something deadly, that they were beyond help, that God's mercy had limits, that hope was for other people. Teresa called this the worst deception, because God's mercy has no limits, no soul is too far gone, no sin too great, no habit too entrenched. But the soul that believes itself beyond help will not reach out, will not ask, will not move, and in that self-imposed paralysis, hope dies. She saw this pattern repeat in different ways across all 7 mansions. In the second mansion, souls who had begun the spiritual journey but hit obstacles. They encountered criticism from others, ridicule, persecution, and instead of pressing through, they retreated. The hope that had drawn them inward flickered and went out. In the third mansion, she saw souls who had achieved a degree of virtue and mistook it for a rival. They were good Catholics, attended Mass, said their prayers, avoided grave sin, but they stopped advancing. They built a comfortable camp in the third mansion and refused to move deeper. They told themselves they had arrived, and in that comfortable self-deception, the hope of greater union with God died quietly, replaced by spiritual complacency. The fourth mansion was where things got dangerous. Here, souls began to experience supernatural touches from God, moments of profound peace, brief experiences of divine presence. But some souls became addicted to the consolation rather than desiring God himself. When the consolation stopped, they despaired. They thought God had abandoned them. They didn't understand that God withdraws the feeling to test the purity of their love. Do they love God, or do they love the feeling of God's presence? Souls who couldn't answer that question correctly often turned back, often fell into worse sins than before, often ended up in a state of bitter resentment toward God. Their hope hadn't just died, it had curdled into something poisonous. Teresa documented specific cases. She saw a person who had lived in mortal sin for 2.5 years. The worst kind of sin, she said. The person came to her for confession. Teresa could see the state of the soul, could see the paralysis, could see hope barely flickering like a candle in its last moments before extinction. She also saw souls who had died and whose final state was sealed. In chapter 38 of her autobiography, she recorded seeing the soul of a certain person whose name she never revealed. She saw the soul fall into that place of interior fire and despair as quickly as a stone dropped from a great height. The demons seized the soul with fury. Teresa said the sight struck her with great fear and horror. This person had been living in apparent virtue for many years, but something inside had died long before the body did. The question Teresa wrestled with was why? Why did God allow her to see these things? What was the purpose of such terrible knowledge? She concluded it was mercy, not punishment, mercy. Because if people understood what happens when hope dies inside the soul, they would fight for it with everything they had. They would guard their interior life like soldiers guard a fortress. They would never make peace with spiritual mediocrity, never accept comfortable distance from God, never stop advancing into the deeper chambers of the castle. Teresa herself had experienced the beginning stages of this death. For 18 years of her religious life, she lived in a state she called lukewarm. She had entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in 1535 at the age of 20. For nearly 2 decades after that, she maintained external observance but had no interior fire, no deep prayer life, no real intimacy with God. She later described this period as spiritual death. Her soul was alive in the technical sense. She was in a state of grace, but the hope of mystical union, the desire for God himself, had gone dormant. She lived in the outer chambers, comfortable with a second-rate spiritual life, not realizing she was dying inside. What changed was a moment of awakening in 1554. She was 39 years old. She was walking through the oratory and saw a statue of Christ covered in wounds from his passion. Something in her broke. She suddenly saw with terrible clarity how far she had drifted from real love of God, how much of her life had been spent in comfortable mediocrity, how close she had come to letting hope die completely. She threw herself on the ground and wept. She felt, she said, as if her heart was being wrung like a cloth. She begged Christ not to let her get up from that place until she was truly converted, until hope was restored, until the fire was lit again. From that day forward, Teresa's prayer life exploded. She began experiencing visions, locutions, raptures. Her whole system was rewired. But she never forgot those 18 years of spiritual paralysis, never forgot how easy it is to let hope die quietly, never stopped warning others about the danger. The mechanics of hope's death are subtle. Teresa laid them out with the precision of a surgeon mapping veins. First comes a small compromise. A soul knows it should pray but skips prayer one day because of busyness. No big deal, just one day. But the next day it's easier to skip again, and again. Within weeks, the habit of prayer is broken. Second comes rationalization. The soul tells itself that God understands, that formal prayer isn't necessary, that working for God's kingdom is more important than spending time in contemplation. All of this sounds reasonable. All of it is poison. Third comes the slow accumulation of small sins. Nothing grave, just venial sins. Little selfishnesses, minor vanities, moments of pride. Each one is small, each one is forgiven easily, but their cumulative effect is paralysis. The soul finds it harder and harder to move toward God. The reptiles have injected their venom. Fourth comes spiritual dryness that the soul misinterprets. God withdraws consolation to test the soul's love. The soul thinks God has abandoned it, thinks prayer is pointless, thinks the spiritual life is a lie. This is the crisis point. If the soul stops praying now, hope begins to die. Fifth comes isolation. The soul stops seeking spiritual direction, stops confessing regularly, stops associating with people who are advancing in prayer. It surrounds itself with tepid souls who justify each other's mediocrity. The soul convinces itself this is humility. It's actually pride disguised. Sixth comes the replacement of God with created things. The soul that has stopped seeking God in prayer starts seeking satisfaction in legitimate created goods. Work, relationships, hobbies, food, entertainment. None of these things are evil in themselves, but they become evil when they replace God as the soul's center. Seventh comes the final stage. The soul no longer desires God. It no longer feels the absence of God as a loss. It has become so accustomed to living in the outer chambers, so comfortable among the reptiles, that it no longer remembers there is a throne room, there is a divine presence, there is a marriage between the soul and God that could be consummated. Hope is dead. The soul is dead. Only the body lives on. Teresa saw this pattern play out in countless souls. She founded her Reformed Carmelite monasteries specifically to create environments where hope could not die. Small communities of 12 to 13 nuns, strict enclosure, no servants, no private rooms, poverty, simplicity, multiple hours of mental prayer daily, all designed to keep souls moving inward toward the throne room. The monastery of St. Joseph in Avila was founded on August 24, 1562. Teresa was 47 years old. She had 4 sisters join her in the new foundation. The house was dedicated to St. Joseph because Teresa had a special devotion to the saint she called the Silent One, the one who had guarded the hope of the world in his heart when everything looked impossible. Within 10 years, Teresa had founded 12 more monasteries. By the time she died in 1582, there were 17 Reformed Carmelite houses across Spain, each one a fortress against the death of hope, each one a training ground for souls learning to move through the mansions toward union with God. But Teresa knew that not everyone lived in a monastery. Most souls had to fight the death of hope in the middle of ordinary life. In marriage, in work, in raising children, in the daily grind of survival. So she wrote The Interior Castle as a manual for these souls. The book is not comfortable. Teresa doesn't soften the realities she saw. She describes the reptiles in detail, the paralysis, the despair, the interior fire, the souls tearing themselves apart. But she also describes the remedy. The remedy starts with recognition. The soul must recognize that it is sick, that it has been bitten by the reptiles, that it is paralyzed, that hope is dying or dead. This recognition is painful. The soul wants to deny it, wants to justify itself, wants to blame circumstances or other people or God himself. But until the soul admits its true state, no healing is possible. Second, the soul must cry out, not with words necessarily, not with eloquent prayers, just with the raw cry of someone who knows they're dying and wants to live. Teresa said this cry is enough. God is waiting for it. The moment the soul cries out sincerely, grace rushes in. Third, the soul must resume prayer. Not elaborate prayer, not mystical prayer, simple mental prayer, 15 minutes a day of sitting in God's presence, acknowledging him, speaking to him as to a friend. Teresa said this simple practice is the door to everything. Without it, the soul stays paralyzed in the outer chambers. With it, the journey inward begins. Fourth, the soul must seek a spiritual director, someone who knows the path, someone who has traveled through the mansions and can guide others. Teresa insisted on this. She said, souls trying to navigate the interior life alone almost always get lost. Almost always get deceived by their own rationalizations or by demonic influences disguised as good thoughts. Fifth, the soul must embrace the cross, not run from suffering, but embrace it. See it as the chisel God uses to carve away everything that is not love. Teresa said, souls who run from the cross stay in the outer mansions forever. Souls who embrace it move rapidly toward the center. Sixth, the soul must practice humility, real humility. Not the false humility that says I'm too wicked for God to love me, but the true humility that says I'm wicked and God loves me anyway. I'm broken and God wants to heal me. I'm paralyzed and God wants to give me motion. This humility is the antidote to the poison of despair. Seventh, the soul must persevere, even when prayer feels dead, even when God seems absent, even when the reptiles are biting and the paralysis is spreading, even when hope feels like it's dying. Persevere, keep praying, keep moving inward, keep crying out, because God is faithful. God will not abandon the soul that continues to seek him. Teresa practiced what she preached. Her own life was a catalog of suffering. She had chronic illnesses from the age of 24, severe headaches, vomiting, heart problems, paralysis in her limbs that lasted 3 years. She couldn't walk, could barely move. The doctors gave up on her. They thought she would die. But during those 3 years of physical paralysis, her soul was moving. She was learning what it meant to hope in God alone, learning what it meant to desire God even when every earthly support was stripped away. When her body finally healed, her soul was stronger than ever. Later in life, she would say that those years of suffering were the best gift God ever gave her, because they taught her that hope does not depend on circumstances, does not depend on health or strength or success or consolation. Hope depends only on God's faithfulness, and God is always faithful. This is what Teresa saw in her visions, souls that had made the mistake of placing their hope in circumstances rather than in God. But when circumstances failed them, their hope died. When health failed, hope died. When relationships failed, hope died. When prayers seemed unanswered, hope died. When the feeling of God's presence withdrew, hope died. But Teresa also saw souls who had learned the secret. Souls whose hope was anchored not in feelings or circumstances, but in the bare fact of God's existence and God's love. These souls could endure anything, could pass through the dark night without despair, could suffer the withdrawal of all consolation without losing heart, could even glimpse the horrors of the place where hope is dead and not be shaken, because their hope was built on rock. In the 6th mansion of the interior castle, Teresa described the trials these souls face, trials specifically designed to test whether their hope is real or counterfeit. God allows them to experience what Teresa called aridity, long stretches where prayer feels impossible, where God seems absent, where the soul feels abandoned. These can last years. Teresa experienced this herself for 18 years of her religious life, and then again at various points even after her great conversion in 1554. She called it dying of the desire to see God. The soul wants God so intensely that the lack of his felt presence is like being torn apart. But it's not despair. It's actually proof that hope is alive. Because only a soul that hopes for union can feel the pain of separation. Teresa distinguished carefully between this suffering and the death of hope. In the suffering of the 6th mansion, the soul still wants God, still prays, still moves toward him even without consolation. But when hope dies, the soul stops wanting, stops praying, stops moving. The desire itself extinguishes. She saw both states in the souls around her. Some of her own nuns at the Convent of the Incarnation fell into the death of hope. They maintained external observance, but their interior life was dead. They went through the motions without heart, without desire, without any real movement toward God. Teresa tried to help them, tried to wake them up, but she found that souls in this state are almost impossible to reach. They've built walls around themselves. They've rationalized their mediocrity. They've convinced themselves that holiness is for other people, that mystical union is for saints, that they're doing fine just maintaining minimum standards. This is why Teresa founded the Reformed monasteries, to create environments where this kind of spiritual death couldn't take root, where every external structure was designed to keep hope alive, where poverty kept souls from placing hope in possessions, where enclosure kept souls from placing hope in the world, where community kept souls from isolating themselves, where hours of daily prayer kept the desire for God burning. But even in these ideal environments, Teresa knew that hope could still die if the soul chose to let it. The environment could support hope, but couldn't force it. Each soul had to choose to keep the flame alive, had to choose to keep moving inward toward the throne room, had to choose to keep desiring God even when desire felt dead. This is the heart of Teresa's teaching. Hope is a choice, not a feeling, not a circumstance, a choice. The soul can choose to hope even in the darkest moments, even when every external support is gone, even when God seems absent, even when the reptiles are biting and the paralysis is spreading. The soul can choose to cry out, can choose to keep praying, can choose to keep moving inward. And that choice is enough. God honors the choice. God rushes to help the soul that chooses hope. Even a flicker of hope is enough. Even the faintest cry is heard. Teresa saw this again and again, saw souls on the brink of spiritual death who made one desperate choice to keep hoping. And that one choice was the hinge on which everything turned. She recorded one case in her spiritual testimonies, a person who had fallen into grave sin and stayed there for over 2 years. The soul was almost completely paralyzed, almost dead, but retained one tiny spark of desire for God, one tiny ember of hope that maybe, possibly, perhaps, God might still have mercy. Teresa saw that ember, saw it flickering in the darkness. She spoke to the person, not with condemnation, not with anger, with encouragement, with the assurance that no soul is beyond God's reach, that no sin is beyond God's mercy, that hope is never wasted on God. The person confessed, and Teresa saw the transformation, saw grace rush into the soul like water into a dry stream bed, saw the paralysis lift, saw the reptiles flee, saw hope reignite. It was, she said, one of the most beautiful things she ever witnessed. A soul rising from death. A soul that had chosen to hope when hope seemed impossible. This is why Teresa wrote, why she founded monasteries, why she traveled across Spain despite chronic illness and constant opposition, because she had seen what happens when hope dies in the soul, had seen the interior fire, the despair, the self-tearing, the darkness, and she could not bear the thought of even one soul ending up in that state. She wrote in The Way of Perfection that she would give 1,000 lives to save one soul from the fate. Not an exaggeration, not rhetoric. She meant it literally, because she had seen it, had experienced a vision so terrible that even writing about it 6 years later made her body go cold, had seen what the death of hope looks like from the inside, and nothing in this world was worth more than preventing that death in even one soul. The stakes were absolute. Teresa understood this in a way most people don't. Most people think of the spiritual life as optional, as something nice for people who are into that sort of thing, as a hobby for religious types. But Teresa saw it as life and death, literal life and death of the soul. You're either moving toward the throne room or you're dying in the outer chambers. There is no middle ground, no neutral territory, no safe mediocrity. This is why her teaching is so urgent, so intense, so uncompromising. She's not interested in making people feel good about spiritual mediocrity. She's interested in saving souls from interior death, from the quiet extinction of hope, from the paralysis that looks fine from the outside, but is spiritual death sentence on the inside. In 1577, when Teresa finished writing The Interior Castle, she was exhausted. She had written the entire manuscript in 67 days while suffering from severe headaches and heart problems. Her confessor, Father Geronimo Gracian, had ordered her to write it. She hadn't wanted to. She felt she had already said everything in her autobiography and her other works. But when she finished, she understood why God had wanted her to write it again. The Interior Castle was clearer, more systematic, more accessible. It laid out the entire spiritual journey in 7 stages, showed the dangers at each stage, showed the remedies, showed how hope could be maintained or lost at every level. And at the center of it all was the vision of the throne room, the 7th mansion, the place of spiritual marriage where the soul and God become so united that they cannot be separated, where hope is no longer needed because it's been replaced by possession, where the soul no longer desires God from a distance but experiences him in permanent, intimate union. Teresa had experienced this state. She reached the 7th mansion in 1572 at the age of 57. She was in Salamanca when it happened. She described it as an intellectual vision of the Trinity, the 3 persons present in her soul in a way so real and distinct that she could never doubt it again. She saw them communicating themselves, not just to her, but to all creation, saw the entire universe held in existence by the love flowing between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And she heard words, "Don't try to hold me within yourself. Try to hold yourself within me." The meaning was clear. Stop trying to contain God in your limited soul. Instead, let your soul be contained in God's infinite being. Let yourself be absorbed into the divine life. Let hope give way to possession. Let desire give way to union. This is what waits in the 7th mansion for every soul, not just for Teresa, not just for mystics and saints. For every single human soul, this is what we were made for. This is the throne room at the center of the castle. This is why hope matters so desperately, because hope is the force that moves the soul inward toward this union. When hope dies, the soul stops moving, stays in the outer chambers, never reaches the purpose for which it was created. Teresa died 5 years after finishing The Interior Castle. She was 67 years old. It was October 4th, 1582. She was in Alba de Tormes, having just finished founding another monastery. She was exhausted, her body finally giving out after decades of illness and relentless travel. The sisters gathered around her bed. She was conscious until the end. Her last words were recorded by Sister Ana de San Bartolome, who was holding her hand. Teresa said, "I am a daughter of the Church. Lord, it is time to go. May your will be done." Then she closed her eyes and was gone. The sister said her face became radiant, peaceful, like she was seeing something beautiful. 9 months later, when they exhumed her body to transfer it to Avila, they found it incorrupt. No decay. No smell. Just the odor of flowers. The church examined her body multiple times over the next decades. Always the same. Incorrupt. The doctors couldn't explain it. The body that had carried so much pain in life showed no signs of death in death. It was as if the hope that had sustained her soul had somehow preserved her body too. But the real legacy wasn't the incorrupt body. It was the writings, the interior castle, the life, the way of perfection, the foundations, hundreds of letters, poems, spiritual testimonies, all of it pointing to one truth. Hope matters. The interior life matters. The movement of the soul toward God matters more than anything else in this world. Because Teresa had seen the alternative, had seen what happens when hope dies quietly inside the soul, had seen the paralysis, the despair, the interior fire, the self-tearing, the darkness without light, the place where souls are powerless to hope for comfort. And she had spent her entire life trying to save people from that fate. Her work didn't end with her death. Her order spread across Europe. Her writings were translated into dozens of languages. Millions of souls over 5 centuries have read The Interior Castle and found in it a map for their own journey. Found in it the warning they needed. Found in it the encouragement to keep hoping when hope seemed dead. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared Teresa a Doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. The recognition was not for her miracles or her visions. It was for her teaching, for the clarity and depth of her doctrine on prayer and the spiritual life, for showing the Church what the interior journey really looks like, what the dangers really are, what the remedies really are, what hope really means. Because at the end of everything, Teresa's message is simple. Hope or die, move inward or stay paralyzed, desire God or settle for reptiles, fight for the interior life or watch your soul tear itself apart in the darkness. There is no middle ground, no comfortable compromise, no safe mediocrity. The castle is there. The throne room is waiting. God is calling every soul deeper. The only question is whether the soul will keep moving, whether it will keep hoping, whether it will keep choosing life over death, keep choosing desire over paralysis, keep choosing God over the comfortable decay of the outer chambers. In 1577, a 62-year-old woman with chronic illness and failing health picked up a quill and wrote down what she had seen, wrote down the architecture of the soul, wrote down the path to union with God, wrote down the dangers that kill hope before the body dies. She wrote it because she had to, because she had seen the alternative, because she could not bear the thought of souls dying in the darkness when light was possible. That manuscript still exists, held in the archives of the Discalced Carmelite order in Rome. You can see Teresa's handwriting, see the corrections she made, see the places where her hand shook from illness, see the bloodstain from where she cut her finger and kept writing anyway. Physical proof that someone saw the death of hope and cared enough to write the antidote. Her tomb in Alba de Tormes draws pilgrims from around the world. They come to see the incorrupt body, to touch the relics, to pray in the room where she died. But the real pilgrimage happens inside, in the castle that Teresa mapped, in the movement from the outer chambers toward the throne room, in the choice to keep hoping when every circumstance says hope is pointless, in the refusal to let the soul die while the body lives. Because that's what Teresa saw. That's what she spent her life fighting against. The quiet death of hope, the paralysis that looks fine from the outside but is spiritual catastrophe on the inside. The souls tearing themselves apart in darkness while standing in the light. The reptiles slowly injecting venom while the soul rationalizes and compromises and drifts. The walls closing in, the breath stopping. The inability to hope for comfort because the capacity for hope itself has died. And the worst part is that it happens quietly. No drama, no obvious crisis. Just a slow fade, a gradual cooling, a quiet extinction, until one day the soul looks up and realizes it's been paralyzed for years, realizes it's been living in the outer chambers, realizes hope has died while it was busy with 1,000 other things. Teresa's final instruction to her nuns was simple. Keep advancing. Never stop moving inward. Never settle. Never make peace with mediocrity. Never let hope die. Because the moment you stop moving, the reptiles start biting. The moment you stop desiring God, the soul starts dying. The moment you lose hope, you enter the darkness from which few ever return. A Carmelite nun named Sister Isabel wrote in 1628 that she had found Teresa's personal prayer book. In the margins, Teresa had written one phrase over and over in different places. God alone suffices. 3 words. But they contain everything. If God suffices, then hope never dies. Because God never fails, never changes, never withdraws his love. The circumstances may fail, the health may fail, The relationships may fail, the feelings may fail, but God suffices. And if God suffices, hope lives.